Welcome back to Way Back History Reactions. I'm Alex. Today we're going to be continuing our look at Brandon F's video, Is This Film Racist? The Patriot, Slavery and Race Relations in Colonial America. We're going to pick up from where we left off in part 1. Let's dive right in.
After all, it is often the case in film, for better or worse, that main characters are exceptional, that they tend to exude modern values in the face of their historical context, again, for better or worse. In this case, I dare say for worse. So let's go through the other portrayals of both slavery and the status of Black Americans more broadly within this film. And we'll start with the plantation of Charlotte, Martin's sister-in-law and his romantic interest. We'll talk about that in a future video. But Charlotte.
Yeah, that is one of the stranger storylines of this film, is the fact that Benjamin Martin eventually falls in love with his dead wife's sister. That is definitely one of the weirder story arcs in this saga of a movie.
The first introduction to Charlotte as a slave owner comes from her home in Charleston. And the very first scene we see here is again a very positive one. We see a very finely dressed and very well-spoken house slave who approaches her calmly, introducing the fact that the children and her brother-in-law are arrived.
Charlotte, the children are here.
It's a nice encounter, to be sure, but really nothing much more to say than that. And actually, on another positive note, if we carry on a little bit further, when Charlotte is being forced to evacuate Charleston once the British take over, though it's never actually explained why she has to flee the town, we actually see what I would classify as the two best portrayals of slavery in this film. Now, not good, mind you, that doesn't exist in this movie, but just the best that it actually has to offer us. Primarily because these next few scenes are some of the only ones in which we see slaves actually performing labor while their owners are not doing so. Here we have Charlotte riding in her carriage with other refugees, while her slaves are carrying her luggage by foot, and they're also driving a larger wagon of materials. Perhaps it's worthy of note, yes, that all of these slaves are very finely dressed again, but again, these are all house slaves. They're serving their mistress directly in a city estate, a townhouse, and they're not necessarily performing terribly taxing physical labor aside from...
So he makes some good points there, and obviously that's something that we talked about yesterday, sort of the different situations that a slave would have been in based on their role. And of course, here in these next few scenes that he's going to illustrate, he believes that they're some of the better portrayals of slavery.
This is a decent enough portrayal because we see the lady sitting in, well, relative luxury, while the slaves are being forced to do the work. She's not, carrying a crate, taking part in it all with them. We do...
So with him not taking too much issue with this scene, there's not too much to comment on from my perspective. So I think we'll skip ahead to where Brandon finds his next point of contention.
Charlotte's plantation. We see here a number of outbuildings indicating an estate of significant scale with Charlotte's slaves moving in the background. Unfortunately, the camera quickly pans upwards following Martin, so we really don't get too much of the estate, but we do see a few glimpses. A woman and two younger girls walking, carrying a single basket between them. Further back, another boy is idly watching them ride past, while a young man pushes a wheelbarrow. Another man in the back there has also stopped his labor to watch them all ride in. As Charlotte's house slave runs forward to inquire after Martin's presence, we see other slaves milling in the back, presumably on some sort of chores, but they don't seem to be doing too much terribly quickly. It's not exactly a terribly harsh portrayal of the life of a slave. Now, of course, both this scene and the last one we discussed clearly took place at a very late hour in the day. It's very...
And again, he's not wrong about that. It certainly is very convenient, as he said in his last video, but I would not necessarily say that that's an attempt to craft any sort of image. It just is the fact that slavery and race relations are ancillary to the main story, so having a conveniently sanitary version of events, but not one that is totally outside the historical record, certainly works for the movie.
Dark in each of them. And as such, yes, it's more understandable that we do not see any instances of slaves actually toiling in the fields, picking away at crops with overseers holding whips standing over their heads, threatening them to carry on their work, as would ultimately be the primary function of a slave, that hard labor in the field. Again, given the hour, some idleness is likely permissible on the estate here. But once again, we come to that factor of convenience. This entire film seems very convenient so far for ignoring the issue of slavery.
Again, I would say the same thing about the fact that it's always night to portray the colonial South in this time without making race relations and slavery the primary focus of the movie essentially means you do have to, exploit these conveniences, if you will. Okay, it's night on an estate where there actually are slaves. In the case of Benjamin Martin, he's got freedmen working for him. But none of this is necessarily ahistorical. I would agree that it's convenient, but that's the case because it's a movie that's not necessarily about these issues.
We never see an instance of a slave performing hard labor.
At least in my opinion, of course.
Not once, unless you count carrying Charlotte's things as hard labor. First, they're just harvesting in an idyllic farm alongside children. Then
they're freedmen, as we just said, conveniently enough, but again, not something outside the historical record.
Doing the easy job while their employer, remember those men aren't actually slaves after all,
Right.
does the hard bit. The house slaves, which we see throughout the film, are never censured. They're never sent away. They're always being treated like just another member of the family. Now, yes, here they are doing some work, but everyone in this scene has to sacrifice. I mean, look at poor old Charlotte. Focus on her, having to flee one of her homes for reasons altogether unspecified.
Well, I don't necessarily think that there's so much sympathy intended to be generated. Obviously, you do see the fact that she is, as he said earlier, living in luxury while being helped out by these slaves. So from that perspective, you don't sympathize. But she is the main character, and so that's why the scene is one that portrays negatively for her suffering, despite the fact that, again, she lives in luxury and with these conveniences, to borrow a word, that she would not have otherwise without her slave helpers.
Of course she has slaves, but no, we'll never actually see them work, because her plantation seems locked in this perpetual twilight hour. Again, how terribly convenient. And when you combine all of these little conveniences together, all of these individually explainable, well, except for one, circumstances, we see built up a collective image of positivity surrounding slavery. But
that seems to be a bit of an exaggeration.
before making this video, I went through this film and I counted literally every instance I could find of black characters at all being shown, and the grand majority of them are well-dressed, well-spoken, gentle folk who are going about their business as equals to the white characters around them. For goodness sake, the first scene that we get of
But is that really true? Because again, that was sort of true when it came to Benjamin Martin's farm. But again, we just saw the scene with Charlotte being, kind of helped out by those house slaves. Not kind of helped out, but totally essentially carried in her carriage, all of her belongings carried by them. So at no point, despite the fact that they are well-dressed, as Brandon pointed out, because they're house slaves, at no point is it portrayed that they're equal in status to her. So I just don't see where he's coming from on that one.
Charleston sees a black gentleman walking down the street, doffing his cap to a white lady and saying, "Morning, Miss Such and Such," to her as if she were an equal to him.
Okay, so that one, I want to make sure that we get this right. So let's take a moment and look this up. Okay, so it does appear that in the late 18th century, there were free African Americans in Charleston. We know that later on, as he mentions, there were certain societal, social restrictions where, you might have to step off the sidewalk for a white person, not look them in the eye, those kinds of things. We see here in 1848, a law came in that required free blacks to wear some kind of tag, but it looks like that at least in the late 1700s, there were free blacks in Charleston, and that tipping your cap to a white person would at least not get you in trouble legally, although it may not have been very socially acceptable.
Really, it's quite enlightened of Charleston high society to allow such a thing, considering that in later years, men were getting lynched for that kind of thing.
True, as we were just talking about.
Patriot is portraying a sense of racial unity, racial harmony in 18th century South Carolina that in many communities you would be hard-pressed to find even today. And there are also, you'll find, of those black characters, remarkably few of them in the entire film, considering that 40% of the entire population of South Carolina was enslaved in 1790.
Okay, but again, the movie, though, is not really about slavery. And again, as we've talked about, it would probably just be a different movie if it was. But the fact of the matter is it's not. It follows a few main characters. We do see the African Americans that they interact with, basically, and we've already analyzed those being obviously Charlotte's plantation or her estate and the accompanying slaves there, as well as the freedmen working for Benjamin Martin. And then there's one black main character who I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. But other than that, there's no real opportunities to portray slaves in this movie, because it's not like they're going through numerous plantations where slaves are just conspicuously absent. Really, the movie's just following the plot of a few main characters, and we do see the African Americans that they interact with.
Was enslaved in 1790. And that's a small portion, incidentally, when compared to 61% in 1750, or later on, we have 47% in 1810. Oh, and of course, it may also be worth mentioning that less than 2,000 non-whites were considered freedmen in South Carolina during that same period. Again, it's very nice of Benjamin Martin to employ such a significant portion of those 2,000 freedmen on his own estate.
We already addressed that situation in the last episode.
So one really must wonder, where are all of these slaves? They make up nearly half of the population in a society which revolves around the institution, so surely we would see them more commonly in the streets, in the fields, more than just a small handful here and there performing very easy tasks.
But again, where would the opportunity even be within the plot of this movie to see that? We basically see the African Americans that the main characters interact with. So again, it's not like there are numerous plantations that they're going through where slaves are conspicuously left out. There just is not a ton of opportunity to show that within the plot of this movie.
Well, not to worry, of course. You see, the Patriot has made sure to employ plenty of black extras. They're all just happen to be crammed into one very particular setting, which Martin hints to at about a third of the way through the film.
We'll go to St. Helena. That's a freed slave island just north of Charlestown.
Note that Martin refers to them as freed slaves, not free or escaped slaves, implying that they were actively set free.
Well, there was actually certainly some of this actually going on at this time. Let's take a look. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. There was a phenomenon in the late 18th and early 19th century with the freeing of slaves in Charleston. And of course, that ended up growing to such an extent and became so off-putting to those who didn't want to see it that, as you see here, by 1841, there was a bill passed in the South Carolina legislature, the Act to Prevent the Emancipation of Slaves. So that shows you that this was going on often enough that there was obviously a need among those who didn't like to see it to prevent it from continuing to happen.
Again, very beneficent of their owners to do so. But that's right, it's a maroon settlement. Maroon, in this context, generally refers to small, independent, mixed communities of escaped slaves and Native Americans on the periphery of European settlements.
And this was a phenomenon not just in North America, but also in European colonies throughout the Caribbean, on the coasts of South America, on the Caribbean coast, as well as on the Central American coast, on the periphery of European settlements in those areas as well.
They were most common in the Caribbean and in South America, particularly on small islands, but some did exist in North America as well, including a significant group of Maroons in the pleasantly named Great Dismal Swamp between Virginia and North Carolina. Now, we're introduced to this island much later on in the film, when Charlotte, alongside Martin's children, become refugees after those evil British burned down their home again. Oh, actually, rewind a little bit to that burning. You see, it's during that scene when Tavington has the house slaves brought to him. He demands to know where the family is, but of course, these are good servants to their mistress, so they refuse to give her up or even to speak to the British in any way. It's very, very honorable of them.
Where are they hiding?
So, shooting the first himself, Tavington has the other slaves.
And just a pause for a moment as we see Jason Isaacs there portraying Colonel Tavington. Jason Isaacs, as really any role, but particularly as a villain, is just phenomenal. And he is fantastic in this movie as Colonel Tavington.
Shot one by one as they continue to refuse to speak to him. You know, like most slaves would do for their owner, these are the good
There
ones.
he is.
They're not going to give up the family even as they're executed one by one in a row. At best, it makes your eyes roll, and at worst, it reinforces that sickening idea that the Southern colonists felt a greater kinship with their own slaves, and indeed the slaves towards their owners, than they ever felt with the British. But again, we'll talk more about that particular power dynamic a little bit later on. For now...
And I mean, listen, the British certainly are portrayed in a certain way in this movie as just sort of supervillains. And, I tend to be kind of on the Anglophilic side. Obviously, we know Mel Gibson's movies, Braveheart, of course, included, tend to be, sort of the Anglophobic. So, that's just one of the things that you're having to sort of take with a grain of salt when you're watching The Patriot. You know that the British, especially as being the antagonists in this movie, are going to be portrayed as sort of comic book supervillains.
Let's go back to the Maroon.
And Jason Isaacs does a great job at playing that role, for sure.
Now, naturally, as a party of white refugees, including a number of armed men, approaches their community of escaped slaves, the Maroons are curious, but they're not really hostile. They don't send out any scouts or an elder, a leader of any sort to speak with them, anything like that to determine their intentions. They just let these strangers saunter on into the middle of the town, where they're reunited with the former house servant, who must have escaped the custody of those evil British.
Well, you got to figure that it would have been a very unusual circumstance that you'd see, a white colonial family walking in here. So I always have seen the Maroons' reaction to them walking in as a sort of almost bemused bewilderment. Sort of, what are these people doing here? So I wouldn't necessarily expect immediate hostility.
They explain the situation, so naturally the Maroons welcome the family in with open arms, including, of course, the woman who used to own a great number of their brethren as property. She's welcome too. There's no sense of questioning among the community. There's no discussion on whether they should house these refugees. No anger on the part of the Maroons towards a former slaveholder. There's not even a sense of them performing a Christian charity by extending hospitality towards a woman who was previously their enemy. No. that all might add a little bit too much depth, a little bit too much character to the Maroons. We can't have that much development with them. They're really here just, again, to show how peaceful and harmonious racial relations could be in America if only everyone just got along. So
No, they're not. They're in this movie essentially as a plot device to, give a large portion of the main characters somewhere to hide out as we come to the climax of the movie. So, I mean, yes, they're portrayed as sort of two-dimensional characters, but at the same time, the alternative probably is that they're not in the movie at all. So, at the same time, there's probably a lot of people who saw this movie who had never heard of Maroon settlements.
we're going to ignore all those elements of character development. Now, naturally, Abigail, the former house servant, lets Charlotte stay with her. Now, of course, compared with the lavish estates and mansions which Charlotte was used to, being waited on hand and foot by house slaves ruling an empire as once she did, well, you would understand if now, relying on the hospitality of a black woman and living in such comparative squalor would lead to, again, a very deep emotional development within this character as she reconciles her old world, her old understanding of reality with her new understanding.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
But no. We'll get that over in about 5 seconds. Let her just turn super woke immediately and, of course, be genuinely thankful before literally never mentioning that dynamic again.
Well, I mean, I don't really get the sense at all. When she first gets in there and looks around, there certainly is a look of dismay on her face as somebody who was coming from wealth and now has to stay, in essentially this shanty town. But I think she's showing a graciousness toward her hosts for essentially providing her hospitality in this difficult situation. Again, I don't think she's necessarily happy about it, but at the same time, she is showing a graciousness, or at least saying the right things.
Later on, of course, when Martin visits the community to see his family, again, there's no reaction by the locals as two armed, military-aged white men approach their settlements at a gallop. Instead, they're just going about their business, including some wonderful shots of the little white boys and the little black boys playing together in the dirt. No tension visible between the natives and the newcomers whatsoever, although one of the kids does nearly knock over this girl in his excitement to run to his father, but I guess that's beside the point. For some unexplained reason, a number of the Maroons also approach to sort of smile and be part of this gathering, of this reuniting, but again, no questioning on the part of anyone of who this white guy is or what he's doing there. They all just sort of accept it. It being later revealed that Martin's son is going to be married, well, of course, what better place to have the ceremony than here? Naturally, it is their local priest who weds them. After all, the Maroons have nothing to do with these traditions or with these people. But still, the whole village will be in attendance for the wedding. Why any of them even care about the wedding to begin with is never explained, nor...
Again, well, we'll let him finish.
Is it, again, why they should have been so enthusiastic in accommodating whatever these white refugees need without that big of a complaint?
Well, you kind of have to figure that similar to the scene when the white refugees first approached them, there is a sort of sense of bewilderment or bemusement as he's, it's correct what Brandon is saying, that this tradition would have been foreign and outside of the traditions practiced by this Maroon village in all likelihood. But this is such an unusual occurrence that you'd have these white settlers here, and now to have a wedding there, certainly it would, at the very least, evoke some curiosity to turn out for it.
Once again, it's beautiful. White and black, they're coming together in harmony. There's no sense of tension or fear or hatred or even just confusion whatsoever. It's only wonderful, racially equitable acceptance between the two. And of course, if those non-Europeans love anything, it's a good party! So after the wedding, they all gather with exotic African-sounding music, hopping and shaking back and forth in celebration of a ceremony which, again, they have nothing to do with, except providing the venue for it. I call this part of the film the Ewok dance party. It's about as sensible and it belongs in the film just about as much.
I mean, I definitely understand the comparison to the Ewok dance scene. I think that's a little bit apt, but at the same time, I really don't think that there's anything wrong with this scene because basically, it sort of portrays tolerance and an open mind, certainly better than the alternative.
And even here, the black characters are hardly that. None of the Maroons outside of Abigail, the house servant, even have any lines. These people are here as props, not characters.
Again, they're not props. The Maroons are only in this movie as a plot device. That's true. But I think that suggesting that there's some sort of token or prop is also incorrect.
Like so many other black characters in this film are. They have no personality beyond the most shallow of two-dimensional traits. They have no depth. They exist solely to give our main characters a place to hide away on some tropical beach paradise.
Yes, I mean, he finally got it. Because, yes, that is exactly why the Maroons are in this movie. But I guess the way I see it is that the alternative is there are no Maroons in this movie.
As if that belongs in a movie about the American War of Independence in the Carolinas. The idea of a Maroon community taking in a slaveholder-turned-refugee provides the writers of this film with some extraordinary opportunities for personal growth of the characters, for an intense and perhaps uncomfortable reflection on the nature of race, of the institution of slavery, and of course of the deep hold which these things held over colonial American society. It offers an excellent opportunity to take a deep look into Maroon culture, how it developed, why it developed, even who these people were. But
there really is not an opportunity to do that because, again, they're only in this movie, as he acknowledged himself in the previous scene, basically as a plot device. So, sure, I would totally agree that a movie flushing out the history of Maroons, particularly those from the Americans' perspective, particularly those that were in the colonies which would become the United States, would be absolutely worthy of a film. But in this film, the Maroons are only in there as a plot device.
Instead, it does none of those things. Instead, what we have here is a dismissive and demeaning portrayal, making the Maroons look like simplistic, noble savages.
See, I didn't get that at all, because, as he says himself, the story of the Maroons is not fully fleshed out. So I don't necessarily think it portrays them really in any specific way because they're not in the movie for very long and they are essentially two-dimensional characters. So I'm not sure exactly where he's coming up with that assertion.
It doesn't treat them with respect, with authenticity to their genuine historical context. It only uses them as convenient props.
Again, not props. They're in there as a plot device. There's a difference. They're not there as some sort of token prop. They're there to provide a real service within the context of the plot, but their story is just not fully flushed out.
So many other black so-called characters in this film, the story of these people's struggle is glossed over and ignored in attempting to show a sense of racial harmony which never existed in this time and place.
Don't really get that at all from this scene.
And again, maybe this would be a little bit less offensive if the Maroons didn't feel like such an out-of-place insert into the film. It doesn't feel very thematically appropriate when compared to the rest of this movie. A line of dialogue here or there, that is all I ask you dignify these people with. But no, that would be just a little bit too much, I suppose. Although, of course, there is one notable exception to all of this. There is one attempt by the writers to get around these problems and to actually acknowledge and reflect upon the reality of slavery in the southern colonies as something which was actually negative for those involved, something that individuals were willing to fight and die to escape from. Something which the nation on the whole would need to overcome if it ever hoped to live up to its revolutionary ideals. There was an attempt to show slavery as a real, living, and breathing human institution, intrinsically and inescapably rooted in colonial American culture. That attempt is in the form of a man named Occam, a slave.
Okay, and so let's leave it there for today. We'll talk about Occam next time. We kind of knew that he was getting to this, so we'll pick that up in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. Again, thank you for checking out our new journey on the Way Back History Reaction channel. I'm Alex. I am out.